There is a city that exists in two worlds at once. In the first world, it is a ruin, a flat, sun-scorched plain in what is now southern Iraq, where the wind moves across crumbled mud-brick walls and the dust settles into the outlines of streets that have not seen a living foot in centuries. The Euphrates River still runs nearby, but it has shifted over the millennia, as rivers do, and the land it once fed has gone dry and pale. If you stood there today, you would see mounds. Low, patient, ancient mounds rising from the earth. The compressed remains of palaces and temples and houses and gardens and libraries and markets. You would see broken pottery scattered at your feet. You would see the faint geometry of walls beneath the surface, visible only to those who know how to look. You might hear the wind, and if you listened carefully enough, you might convince yourself you heard something else beneath it, something older, something vast. In the second world, Babylon is very much alive. It lives in every holy text ever written. It lives in the imagination of every person who has ever heard its name and felt, without quite knowing why, that the name means something enormous. It lives in the word we still use for any city so great, so excessive, so luminous with human ambition that it seems to belong more to legend than to history: Babylon. The word itself carries weight. It always has. Tonight, we are going to spend a long time in both of those worlds. We are going to walk through the city that actually existed, the one built by real human hands over more than 2,000 years, the one that rose from a small settlement on a riverbank into the largest, most magnificent, most consequential city on the face of the ancient earth. We are going to meet the kings who made it and the kings who broke it. We are going to stand inside its walls when they were the thickest walls in the world, and we are going to watch those walls fall. We are going to follow the story of a civilization so extraordinary that even after it ended, it never really ended. And we are going to do all of this slowly, at night, in the dark, the way the best stories have always been told. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to thank you for being here. Whether this is your first time listening to History for Sleep, or you have been with me for a while, I am genuinely grateful. These stories take a long time to research and to write, and knowing that they find their way to you, that they accompany you into sleep, that they make the quiet hours a little less quiet and a little less empty, that means more to me than I can easily say. If this kind of storytelling resonates with you, I hope you will subscribe, because there are many more cities and civilizations and forgotten worlds waiting to be told. And if you want to leave a comment, I would love to know where in the world you are right now and what time it is where you are. There is something I find deeply moving about the idea of people in different time zones, in different countries, in different seasons, all drifting towards sleep on the same words. If you are watching this to fall asleep, that is exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where you are right now and what time it is. Now, let us begin at the beginning, which means we must begin with water. In the beginning, there was the river, two rivers actually, running roughly parallel through a broad, flat valley between the mountains of Anatolia to the north and the Persian Gulf to the south, the Tigris and the Euphrates. They have been called many things over many millennia, but perhaps the most accurate thing you can call them is the reason. The reason that civilization, as we understand it, began in this particular place and not somewhere else. The reason that cities first appeared here, that writing was invented here, that law was codified here, that the very idea of organized human society took its first breath here, in this valley between two rivers, that the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, the land between the rivers. The valley itself is not dramatic. There are no great mountains in it, no deep forests, no spectacular coastlines. It is flat and wide, and in the summer, brutally hot. The soil is heavy with silt brought down from the mountains over thousands of years of flooding, and this is the thing, the silt. Because while the landscape offers no natural drama, the soil it produces is extraordinary, rich beyond almost anything else in the ancient world, capable of growing crops in quantities that would have seemed impossible to people living in thinner, rockier lands. But the fertility of the land was not automatic. It had to be earned. The rivers flooded, and the floods were not gentle or predictable. They could be catastrophic. they could wipe out everything a community had built in a single season. To survive in Mesopotamia, people had to learn to work together, to dig channels and build levees and manage water in organized, coordinated ways that required more than family groups could provide. They required something new. They required something that had never quite existed before on the face of the earth. They required cities. And so, cities came into being here in this valley around 5,000 or 6,000 years ago. The first ones were in the south, in a region the ancient inhabitants called Sumer, and then slightly to the north, in a region called Akkad. Small cities at first, by any modern standard, a few thousand people. Clusters of mud brick houses around a central temple, surrounded by fields and irrigation canals. But cities nonetheless, with all the complexity that cities bring. Specialization of labor, trade, laws, religion formalized into something with priests and rituals and sacred calendars. Writing, born here, invented for the thoroughly practical purpose of keeping track of grain and livestock, and only later used for anything as ambitious as poetry or history or law. Babylon was not among the first of these cities. It was not a Sumerian city. It appears in the historical record, late, quietly, almost without announcement, as a small settlement on the western bank of the Euphrates in the region of Akkad. Its name in the ancient Sumerian language was something like Kadingirah, which means Gate of God. In the Akkadian language that would eventually supersede Sumerian, it was Babalim, which means the same thing, Gate of God, or in some translations, Gate of the Gods, plural. Because the gods of Mesopotamia were many, and the city that would rise here would eventually become home to all of them, the earliest mentions of Babylon in the cuneiform tablets that survive from this period are modest. It is mentioned as a minor administrative center, a place where goods pass through, a waypoint on a trade route rather than a destination in itself. There is nothing in these early records to suggest that this particular settlement, among the dozens of competing cities and city-states in Mesopotamia, is about to become anything extraordinary. But the land around it is good. The river runs close. And the people who live there are learning, over generations, what it means to be part of something larger than a single family or a single village. They are learning what it means to be Babylonian. They just do not know it yet. The first great transformation of Babylon came from outside. Around 2300 BCE, a king named Sargon of Akkad did something that no one in Mesopotamia had managed to do before. He conquered not just a single city or a small collection of nearby towns, but the entire region. One by one, the independent city-states of Sumer and Akkad fell to his armies, and Sargon stitched them together into a single political entity, the world's first empire. He called himself king of the four corners of the world, which was not modesty, but it was not entirely inaccurate either, because from his perspective, Akkad essentially was the world, or at least the world that mattered. Babylon, at this time, was part of Sargon's empire, but it was not its center. The capital was the city of Akkad itself, whose ruins have never been definitively located by archaeologists, which gives it a quality of additional mystery. But the Akkadian Empire established something crucial for Babylon's future. It created the idea of unified Mesopotamia. It created the administrative structures and trade networks and shared cultural frameworks that would make it possible, centuries later, for one city to become the dominant hub of the entire region. The Akkadian Empire did not last. Empires in this period rarely did. A combination of external pressure from the mountain peoples to the northeast, called the Gutians, and the internal contradictions that any empire faces as it tries to hold diverse populations together under a single authority, brought Sargon's dynasty to an end within a few generations. What followed was a period of fragmentation, of competing kingdoms and shifting alliances, of the kind of complex, messy, human history that is difficult to follow in broad strokes, but endlessly fascinating in detail. During this period, Babylon continued to exist. It continued to grow, slowly. It absorbed influences from the various powers that rose and fell around it. It was ruled at different points by different dynasties, some Sumerian, some Akkadian, some from peoples whose origins we still debate. But it was not yet Babylon in the way we mean when we say that word. It had not yet become the thing it was about to become. That transformation began around 1894 BCE, when a man named Sumu Abum established a new dynasty in Babylon. He was an Amorite, part of a broader group of Semitic-speaking people from the western desert regions who had been migrating into Mesopotamia for generations. The Amorites were not, at this point, conquering heroes or great empire builders. They were settlers, adapters, people who had absorbed the culture of Mesopotamia even as they brought their own traditions to it. Sumuabum was, in the surviving records, a practical man. He fortified Babylon, he dug canals, he administered competently. He did not change the world, but he started the dynasty that would. 6 kings of the Amorite dynasty of Babylon ruled in succession after Sumuabum, each one building slightly on what the last had left, consolidating control over the immediate surrounding area, managing the constant military and diplomatic pressures that life in ancient Mesopotamia required. They were not insignificant rulers, but history has largely forgotten their individual names, except to specialists. The 7th king of the dynasty was different. His name was Hammurabi, and with him, Babylon became Babylon. You have probably heard the name Hammurabi. If you know one thing about ancient Babylon, it is probably this name. And if you know one thing about Hammurabi, it is probably his law code. The Code of Hammurabi. A collection of nearly 300 laws inscribed on a tall black diorite stele, topped with a relief carving of Hammurabi, standing before the sun god Shamash, who is depicted handing the king the symbols of justice. The stele was discovered in 1901 by French archaeologists, and it is now in the Louvre in Paris, and it has been one of the most studied and written about objects in all of archaeology ever since. But before we get to the laws, we need to understand the man, and the world he inherited, and what he did with it. Hammurabi came to the throne of Babylon around 1792 BCE, when he was probably still a young man. The Mesopotamia he inherited was a fractured world. The old unified structures of the Akkadian Empire were long gone. In their place was a complicated landscape of competing city-states and small kingdoms, each pursuing its own interests, each making and breaking alliances as circumstances required. The major powers at the time included the Kingdom of Larsa to the south, the Kingdom of Eshnunna to the northeast, the Kingdom of Mari to the northwest along the Euphrates, and the Kingdom of Assyria further north. Babylon was one player among many, not particularly dominant, not particularly weak. Hammurabi spent the first decades of his reign doing what any shrewd ruler in this environment had to do. He watched, he listened, he maintained careful relationships with his neighbors, making alliances when alliances served him, and waiting. He appears to have been a man of exceptional patience and exceptional intelligence because he waited a long time, and the whole time he was waiting, he was preparing. He reformed Babylon's administration. He dug canals and improved irrigation, which increased agricultural productivity and the city's wealth. He corresponded constantly with his officials throughout his territory, and we know this because thousands of his letters survive, written in cuneiform on clay tablets, covering everything from major policy decisions to remarkably mundane administrative details. He was a hands-on ruler in the most literal sense, engaged with the day-to-day mechanics of governance in a way that few ancient kings documented so thoroughly. And then, around the 30th year of his reign, he moved. Over a period of roughly 10 years, Hammurabi transformed Babylon from a regional power into the undisputed master of Mesopotamia. He defeated Larsa to the south, he defeated Eshnunna to the northeast. He defeated Mari to the northwest, and then destroyed it so thoroughly that its ruins were not excavated until the 20th century. He extended Babylon's reach northward and southward, until the city on the Euphrates was the center of an empire that encompassed nearly all of the region the Sumerians and Akkadians had once called the known world. The speed and completeness of this transformation was astonishing. In the span of a single decade, the political geography of Mesopotamia was rewritten. Babylon was not just the largest city in the region, it was, according to the records that survive, the largest city in the world. And Hammurabi wanted everyone to know what kind of city it was going to be. This is where the laws come in. The Code of Hammurabi was not, strictly speaking, the world's first law code. There were earlier examples, most notably the laws of Ur-Nammu, a Sumerian king from around 2100 BCE. But Hammurabi's code was the most comprehensive, the most detailed, and by far the most widely disseminated of the ancient world. And it tells us more about Babylonian society than perhaps any other single document from this period. The laws cover an extraordinary range of human activity. There are laws about trade, about property, about inheritance. There are laws about marriage, about divorce, about adoption. There are laws about wages, about the obligations of landlords to tenants, about the responsibilities of builders to the people who hire them to construct their houses. One law specifies that if a builder builds a house that collapses and kills the owner, the builder shall be put to death. If it kills the owner's son, the builder's son shall be put to death. This is a logic that feels strange to modern sensibilities, but within its own framework, it is a logic of proportionality, of equivalence, of the idea that justice means that harm is answered with harm of equal measure. The most famous phrase associated with Hammurabi's code is an eye for an eye. The actual Babylonian text is somewhat more elaborate, but the principle is accurate. This is lex talionis, the law of retaliation, and it sounds harsh, but in the context of the ancient world, it was actually a form of restraint, because before codified law of this kind, the response to harm was not necessarily proportionate. It was whatever the aggrieved party, or their family, or their patron could manage. Blood feuds, unlimited retribution. The Code of Hammurabi was, in part, an attempt to impose limits on vengeance, to establish that justice had a ceiling as well as a floor. The laws also reveal the social structure of Babylonian society with striking clarity. There were three classes of people under Hammurabi's law: the Awilim, which were free citizens of the upper class, the Mushkanim, which were a kind of middle class or dependent class, and the Wardim, which were slaves. The penalties for the same offence varied depending on which class you belonged to and which class your victim belonged to. An offence against a person of higher class was punished more severely than the same offence against a person of lower class. This is not a principle we would endorse today, but it tells us something true and important about the world Hammurabi governed, which was a deeply hierarchical society in which social position was legally encoded and legally enforced. What the laws also reveal, in aggregate, is a society of remarkable commercial sophistication. Babylon, under Hammurabi, was not a simple agricultural settlement. It was a commercial metropolis. Merchants operated under detailed regulations governing their activities. Interest rates on loans were specified. The procedures for resolving commercial disputes were codified. There were laws about the storage of goods in warehouses, about the liability of caravans for lost merchandise, about the conditions under which contracts could be voided. This was a city that lived and breathed trade, and its laws were designed to make that trade as reliable and predictable as possible. Hammurabi had the code inscribed on multiple steles and placed them in public locations throughout his empire, which meant that even in cities far from Babylon, people could see the laws of the Babylonian king carved into stone. It was a statement of authority, but it was also, in its way, a statement of something else. A claim that law itself, the codification of rules for human behavior, was one of the gifts that civilization had to offer. That the city on the Euphrates was not just the most powerful place in the world. It was the most organized, the most just, the most fully realized version of what a human community could be. Whether that claim was true is a different question, but the claim itself mattered. It shaped how Babylon understood itself, and it shaped how the world understood Babylon for centuries to come. Hammurabi died around 1750 BCE, after a reign of more than 40 years. He was succeeded by his son Samsu-iluna and then by a series of increasingly less effective rulers who found, as rulers always have found, that maintaining an empire is considerably harder than building one. Within a generation or two of Hammurabi's death, the cracks in the Babylonian Empire were visible. Within a century, they were catastrophic. The first dynasty of Babylon ended not with a dramatic military defeat, but with something stranger and, in its way, more poetic. Around 1595 BCE, a king of the Hittites, a people from what is now central Turkey, launched a raid down the Euphrates Valley. He was not trying to conquer Babylon. He was not trying to build an empire there. He was, apparently, simply raiding, taking what he could and leaving. But what he took was devastating. He sacked the city. He carried off the great statue of Marduk, the chief god of Babylon, which was not just a religious object but a political one, because in Mesopotamian theology, the god of a city was its protector and its legitimator, and without the god, the king had no divine backing for his authority. And then the Hittite king turned around and went home. He left Babylon not conquered, but decapitated. The dynasty that had ruled for nearly 2 centuries simply collapsed in the aftermath, and into the power vacuum stepped a people who had been lurking at the edges of Mesopotamian history for decades: the Kassites. The Kassites are one of the most intriguing and least understood peoples of the ancient Near East. Their origins are unclear. They appear to have come from the mountain regions to the northeast of Mesopotamia, but their language does not belong to any known language family, which means that linguists cannot trace their roots through comparative analysis, the way they can with the speakers of Semitic or Indo-European languages. They seem to have entered Mesopotamia gradually, as soldiers and laborers, before the collapse of the first Babylonian dynasty. And when that collapse came, they were positioned to fill the vacuum. The Kassite dynasty of Babylon lasted for roughly 4 centuries, from around 1595 BCE to around 1155 BCE, which makes it the longest single dynasty in Babylonian history. This is a remarkable fact, and a somewhat counterintuitive one, because the Kassites are often characterized in older scholarship as somehow less civilized than the Babylonians they replaced. This characterization is now recognized as both wrong and reflecting the biases of the scholars who made it. The Kassites were, in fact, sophisticated rulers who presided over a period of considerable Babylonian stability and cultural development. They embraced Babylonian culture with an enthusiasm that bordered on total adoption. They worshipped the Babylonian gods. They wrote in the Babylonian language. They administered their empire using the Babylonian bureaucratic traditions. In this, they were following a pattern that would recur throughout Babylonian history, which is that Babylon, even when conquered, somehow conquered its conquerors. The city was so culturally dominant, so deeply embedded in the traditions and self-understanding of the entire region, that even foreign rulers who arrived with their own languages and customs found themselves, within a generation or two, becoming Babylonian. Under the Kassites, Babylon rebuilt from the devastation of the Hittite raid. The city grew, trade networks were re-established, the great temples were repaired and expanded. The Kassites introduced new artistic styles, most notably the kuduru, which were boundary stones, inscribed with legal documents and decorated with the symbols of various gods, used to record land grants and other royal edicts. These kudurus are some of the most distinctive artifacts of the Kassite period, and they reveal a society that was actively engaged with the traditional Babylonian religious and legal frameworks, even while bringing new artistic sensibilities to them. The Kassite period was also one of international diplomacy, on a scale that Mesopotamia had not previously known. We have a remarkable archive of clay tablets from this period called the Amarna letters, discovered in Egypt in the 19th century, which is a collection of diplomatic correspondence between the Egyptian pharaohs and the major powers of the ancient Near East, including the Kassite kings of Babylon. In these letters, the kings address each other as brothers, which was the diplomatic convention of the time for indicating equal status, and they exchange elaborate gifts and sometimes complain to each other with a frankness that feels surprisingly human across the gap of 3,000 years. One Kassite king wrote to the Egyptian pharaoh to complain that the gifts he had received were insufficient compared to what he had sent. He was not shy about it. He wanted better gold, he said, and he wanted it promptly. In return, he would send lapis lazuli and horses. This is not the language of gods or myths. It is the language of shrewd men negotiating across a very large trading system, and it reminds us that beneath all the religious and royal rhetoric of the ancient world, there were human beings with very human concerns about reciprocity and fairness, and not being taken advantage of. The Kassite dynasty came to an end around 1155 BCE, brought down by a combination of external pressure from the Assyrians to the north and the Elamites to the east. Once again, Babylon was sacked. Once again, the statue of Marduk was carried off, this time to the Elamite capital. Once again, the city survived, because Babylon always survived. The centuries that followed the fall of the Kassite dynasty were not Babylon's finest. A series of short-lived dynasties succeeded each other, some native to Mesopotamia, some from neighboring regions. The city was contested, occupied, liberated, contested again. The Assyrians, the rising power to the north, grew increasingly dominant in Mesopotamian affairs, and their relationship with Babylon was one of the great ongoing tensions of the first millennium BCE. The Assyrians were, in many respects, the opposite of what Babylon represented. Where Babylon was a city of commerce and culture and law, Assyria was a kingdom of soldiers. The Assyrian Empire that expanded through the 9th, 8th, and 7th centuries BCE was built on military force more explicitly and more brutally than almost any political entity before it. The Assyrian kings recorded their campaigns in vivid detail, including their treatment of conquered peoples, which was often savage. They were not modest about their violence. They boasted about it in their royal inscriptions, because in their world, the display of absolute power was itself a form of governance. It kept peoples in line. It made rebellion seem not just dangerous, but futile. Babylon, as the richest and most symbolically important city in the region, was a constant object of Assyrian attention. Some Assyrian kings recognized Babylon's cultural prestige and tried to rule it with a degree of respect, presenting themselves as legitimate Babylonian kings. Rather than simply conquerors, they patronized the temples, supported the priests, participated in the religious festivals that were central to Babylonian civic life. There was, in other words, a political wisdom available to Assyrian rulers about how to manage Babylon, which was to honor it rather than to simply dominate it. Not all of them had that wisdom. The most catastrophic episode in Babylon's relationship with Assyria came in 689 BCE, when the Assyrian king Sennacherib did something that shocked the ancient world. He destroyed Babylon, not sacked, not conquered, destroyed, deliberately, systematically, with an evident fury that the records suggest went beyond military calculation into something more personal, more ideological. Sennacherib's annals record that he obliterated the city so completely that even its foundations were scraped away. He diverted canals over the ruins to flood them. He salted the earth. He carried off the gods and their temples. He wanted to erase Babylon not just as a city, but as an idea. The reasons for this extraordinary act are debated by scholars. Sennacherib had been dealing with repeated Babylonian rebellions, often supported by the Chaldeans, a tribal group from the southern marshes who had become a major force in Babylonian politics. He had lost a son to one of these conflicts. There is a sense in his records of accumulated frustration boiling over into something that had moved past strategy into rage. Whatever his reasons, the destruction of Babylon sent a shockwave through the ancient Near East. It was as if Rome had been erased from the map during the height of the Roman Empire. The city that was the center of civilization, the city whose gods were the oldest and most revered, the city that everyone in the region understood as foundational to the world they lived in, was gone. The shock of this event, it appears, contributed to the political difficulties that would eventually bring down Sennacherib himself He was assassinated by his own sons, the records tell us. And while the connection between the destruction of Babylon and his murder is not explicit in the sources, Babylonian tradition later interpreted it as divine punishment. Marduk, the god of Babylon, had taken his revenge. Sennacherib's successor, Esarhaddon, understood the political reality immediately. He had to rebuild Babylon. Not because he wanted to, necessarily, but because Babylon's symbolic importance was so enormous that its absence was a source of instability for his entire empire. He began the reconstruction, and his successor, Ashurbanipal, continued it. Within decades, Babylon was alive again, but it was not yet the Babylon of legend. That city was still to come. The Babylon that most people imagine when they hear the word, the city of the great walls, and the Ishtar Gate, and the hanging gardens, is the Babylon of the Neo-Babylonian Empire, the Babylon of the late 7th and 6th centuries BCE. And the man most responsible for that Babylon was a king named Nebuchadnezzar II. But to understand Nebuchadnezzar, we need to understand how the Neo-Babylonian Empire came to be, which requires us to understand the remarkable figure of his father, Nabopolassar. Nabopolassar was a Chaldean from the marshy southern regions of Babylon, who rose to power in Babylon around 626 BCE. He did so by aligning himself with the Babylonian priests and population against the Assyrian domination that had been a feature of Babylonian life for generations. He was not at first a king. He was more like a resistance leader, a man who embodied Babylonian resentment of Assyrian control and channeled it into political and then military action. The opportunity he needed came from the north and east. The Assyrian Empire, which had seemed so utterly dominant, was in fact in serious trouble. Its expansion had overextended its resources. Internal succession disputes had weakened the royal line, and a new power was rising in the east, in the Iranian plateau, in the form of the Medes, an Iranian people who had been building their own state and their own military forces for decades. Nabopolassar and the Medes found each other. They found each other because they had a common interest, which was the destruction of Assyria. Their alliance, cemented by the marriage of Nabopolassar's son Nebuchadnezzar to the Median princess Mightiest, was one of the decisive political arrangements of the ancient world. The war against Assyria was brutal and prolonged, but the outcome was decisive. In 612 BCE, the combined Babylonian and Median forces sacked Nineveh, the Assyrian capital. The city that had boasted it was the greatest in the world, the city whose kings had destroyed Babylon a century before. The destruction of Nineveh was so complete that within a few generations, people living in the area did not know there had ever been a great city there. The prophet Nahum, writing in the Hebrew scriptures, had predicted that Nineveh would become a ruin, and it did, so thoroughly that it was not rediscovered by archaeologists until the 19th century CE. Assyria did not disappear immediately. Remnants of the Assyrian state retreated westward and tried to regroup, with Egyptian support, at the city of Haran and then at Carchemish on the Euphrates. Nabopolassar's son Nebuchadnezzar, acting as a general under his father's authority, pursued and defeated them. The Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE was effectively the end of Assyria as a political force. Nebuchadnezzar, still on campaign in the west when his father died, rushed back to Babylon to claim the throne. He was probably in his early 20s. He would reign for more than 40 years, and he would build the greatest city the ancient world had ever seen. To understand what Nebuchadnezzar built, you need to understand what was already there. Babylon in 605 BCE was already a very old and very large city. It was not a blank slate. It had temples and palaces and neighborhoods that went back centuries. It had traditions and hierarchies and religious practices that were ancient before Nebuchadnezzar was born. He did not create Babylon, he magnified it. He took a great city and made it into something that had not previously existed, something so enormous and so elaborate and so deliberately overwhelming that it entered the collective imagination of the ancient world as the definitive image of urban civilization. The statistics, where we have them, are breathtaking. Babylon, under Nebuchadnezzar, covered an area of roughly 10 square kilometers, within its outer walls, which made it by far the largest city in the world at the time. The city's population is estimated by scholars at somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 people, though some estimates go higher. And while these numbers carry the uncertainty inherent in any ancient demographic calculation, they are consistent with the archaeological evidence for the city's extent. For comparison, Rome, at this period, was a much smaller city. Athens was a much smaller city. The great cities of the Near East and the Mediterranean would not approach Babylon's scale for centuries. The walls were the first thing. The walls of Babylon were so famous in the ancient world that they were later included on several lists of the 7 wonders of the world, though they were eventually displaced from the canonical list by the Hanging Gardens. The inner wall was called Imgur Enlil. The outer wall was called Nimiti Enlil. Together, they formed a double ring of fortification around the city that was, by ancient standards, effectively impregnable. The inner wall alone was reportedly wide enough at the top for 2 chariots to pass each other, which would make it perhaps 8 meters wide, and it rose to a considerable height. Along its length were towers at regular intervals, providing overlapping fields of fire for defenders. But the walls were not just military infrastructure, they were a statement. Walking toward Babylon from any direction, you would see these walls long before you saw anything else. Long before you could make out the tops of the ziggurats or the gates or the houses. Just the walls, rising from the flat plain like a geological feature, like something the earth itself had produced rather than human hands. The message was not subtle. This city will not be taken. This city is permanent. This city is a fact of the world, like the river and the sky. The gates were the portals through which that message became hospitality. There were 8 gates into the city, each named for a deity in the Babylonian pantheon. The most famous, and the one that survived in fragments sufficient for reconstruction, was the Ishtar Gate, named for the goddess of love and war. And it was extraordinary. The Ishtar Gate faced north on the processional way that led into the city from that direction. It was a double gate, meaning that visitors passed through 2 successive gateways before entering the city proper. The towers on either side rose to a height of perhaps 15 meters, and the entire surface, towers and gateways alike, was covered in glazed bricks in a deep, saturated blue, accented with rows of reliefs depicting the sacred animals of Babylon's most important gods. The Sirush, a dragon-like composite creature associated with Marduk; the bull, associated with Adad, the storm god. Row after row of these creatures, rendered in a red-glazed brick that stood out brilliantly against the blue background, marching up the walls in perfect procession. The effect would have been staggering. You come across the flat Mesopotamian plain, sun-bleached and wide, and you approach this gate, and suddenly you are confronted with this wall of intense color, this vision of supernatural creatures in brilliant glaze, this proclamation that you are entering a city that is under divine protection, that the gods themselves stand at its gates. Beyond the Ishtar Gate, the processional way ran south through the heart of the city for a considerable distance, lined on both sides by walls, also decorated with glazed brick reliefs, in this case depicting lions, the symbol of Ishtar herself. Dozens of lions, rendered in a naturalistic style that reflects the sophistication of Babylonian artistic traditions, striding southward down the walls. Their eyes were made of rock crystal, which would have caught the light, and at night, with torches burning along the processional route, the effect would have been somewhere between magnificent and uncanny. The processional way led to the great temple complex of Marduk, which was the religious center of the city and, in a very real sense, the center of the entire known world, as Babylonians understood it. The Esagila, meaning house with the raised head, was the main temple of Marduk, a complex of sanctuaries and courtyards spread over a considerable area. Within it stood the shrine of Marduk himself, a chamber containing the great golden statue of the god, which was the most sacred object in Babylon, the divine presence that legitimized the king's rule, the object whose capture or destruction was the ultimate catastrophe that could befall the city. Beside the Esagila stood the ziggurat of Babylon, called Etemenanki, which means house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The ziggurat was a stepped temple tower, a form of sacred architecture that was ancient in Mesopotamia by Nebuchadnezzar's time, going back to the Sumerians and beyond. But the ziggurat of Babylon was the most ambitious one ever built. It rose, according to the best reconstructions, based on the surviving foundation and ancient descriptions, to a height of approximately 90 meters. In a landscape as flat as the Mesopotamian plain, 90 meters is not just tall, it is visible from a very long distance. It was, quite literally, a mountain built by human hands in a land that had no mountains, a stairway to the sky, a connection between the human world and the divine one. Many scholars believe that this ziggurat, the Great Tower of Babylon, is the origin of the Tower of Babel story in the Book of Genesis. Whether or not that connection holds, the ziggurat of Babylon clearly made an impression on everyone who saw it, because it appears in multiple ancient sources from multiple cultures as one of the defining images of the city. Nebuchadnezzar also built the Southern Palace, a complex of royal buildings near the Ishtar Gate that served as the administrative and residential center of the empire. The palace covered a vast area, divided into multiple courtyards and suites of rooms, with walls decorated in glazed brick and painted plaster. It contained the throne room where Nebuchadnezzar received ambassadors and administered justice, a room whose scale and decoration were designed to overwhelm visitors with the power and majesty of the Babylonian king. And then, there is the question of the Hanging Gardens. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon are one of the most famous things that may not have existed, or that existed, but perhaps not, in Babylon. They appear on the ancient list of the 7 wonders of the world. They are described by ancient writers, most notably Diodorus Siculus, Strabo, and Quintus Curtius Rufus, all of whom wrote centuries after Nebuchadnezzar's time, none of whom appear to have visited Babylon themselves. Their descriptions are detailed and vivid. A series of terraces, rising one above the other, planted with trees and flowers and vines, watered by an elaborate mechanical system that lifted water from the Euphrates to the upper levels, so that the whole thing appeared from a distance to be a mountain of green in the middle of the flat city. Beautiful, implausible, dreamlike. The problem is that archaeologists have spent considerable effort examining the ruins of Babylon, and they have not found evidence of the Hanging Gardens. They have found the palaces, they have found the temples, they have found the streets and houses and workshops. They have not found the gardens. A structure of the scale described would leave significant physical traces. The irrigation infrastructure alone, the pumps and channels required to move water to considerable heights, would be detectable in the archaeological record. So far, it has not been found. Several theories exist to explain this. One is that the gardens were destroyed so completely, perhaps by the flooding of the Euphrates or by later demolition and construction, that no trace remains. Another is that the ancient descriptions are exaggerated or confused accounts of something that was real but less dramatic than the legend suggests. Perhaps there were roof gardens in the palace complex, beautifully maintained, that were later transformed by oral tradition and literary retelling into something more spectacular. Perhaps the truth is somewhere in the middle. A more radical theory, proposed by the scholar Stephanie Daly, is that the Hanging Gardens were not in Babylon at all. They were in Nineveh, built by the Assyrian king Sennacherib, and were attributed to Babylon by later writers who conflated or confused the two cities. Daly's argument is detailed and careful, drawing on specific Assyrian texts that describe garden features consistent with what the ancient sources attribute to the Hanging Gardens. And if she is right, then the most famous feature of Babylon never belonged to Babylon at all. We do not know. We may never know. And there is something fitting about that uncertainty, because Babylon has always been partly a real city and partly an idea. And ideas are not always subject to archaeological verification. What we do know is that Nebuchadnezzar's Babylon was extraordinary enough without the gardens. The walls, the gates, the processional way, the temples, the palaces, the scale of the whole enterprise, these were real, and they were more than enough to justify the reputation. Nebuchadnezzar's empire stretched from the Persian Gulf to the borders of Egypt, encompassing the entire region of what is now Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and parts of Jordan and Turkey. It was a commercial empire as much as a military one, and Babylon sat at its center like a spider at the center of its web, drawing in the threads of trade that connected the Mediterranean world to the Persian plateau, to Arabia, to Egypt. The city's marketplaces were the commercial hub of the ancient Near East. Merchants from Egypt brought linen and papyrus. Merchants from Anatolia brought silver and timber. Merchants from the Persian plateau brought lapis lazuli, that deep blue stone that the Babylonians prized above almost any other material, and tin for making bronze and horses. Merchants from Arabia brought spices and incense and gold. Merchants from the Levantine coast brought purple dye and the luxury goods of the Mediterranean world. The streets near the river docks were crowded, loud, and fragrant in ways that were not always pleasant. The smell of livestock and fish and exotic spices and river mud all mixed together in the heat of the Mesopotamian summer. The sound of multiple languages. Aramaic, which had become the lingua franca of the empire, a kind of ancient trade language that people from different regions could use to communicate, but also Babylonian and Egyptian and the various languages of the merchants from the east and the west. The visual texture of different clothing, different complexions, different styles of dress, marking people from different parts of the known world, all converging on this single point in the flat valley of the Euphrates. This was one of the things that made Babylon extraordinary, and also one of the things that made it, to some people, looking in from outside, somewhat troubling. It was a cosmopolitan city in the deepest sense of the word, a city of the world, belonging to no single people or culture, but synthesizing them all. For those who valued cultural purity, this synthesis could seem like corruption. For those who valued human connection and exchange, it was civilization in its most complete form. The Hebrew scriptures, which contain some of the most vivid ancient descriptions of Babylon, reflect this ambivalence. Babylon appears in them both as the city of wonders and as Babylon the Great, the mother of harlots and abominations of the earth, in the phrase from the book of Revelation that would echo through centuries of Western religious thought. The same city that provoked wonder provoked horror. The same excess that made it magnificent made it, to those who believed, in a different kind of order, a kind of threat. We cannot understand the Jewish relationship with Babylon without understanding what Nebuchadnezzar did to Jerusalem. In 605 BCE, shortly after becoming king, Nebuchadnezzar moved his armies west, into the Levant, following up the victory at Carchemish. He encountered and defeated the Egyptian forces that were trying to establish control in the region, and he extended Babylonian authority over the small kingdoms of the Levantine coast. Among those kingdoms was Judah, whose capital was Jerusalem. The relationship between Babylon and Judah over the following 2 decades was one of the most consequential in ancient history. Not because Judah was militarily significant, which it was not, but because the story of what happened was preserved in detail in the Hebrew scriptures and shaped the religious and cultural trajectory of a tradition that would influence half of human civilization. Nebuchadnezzar's initial demands on Judah were the standard requirements of a regional overlord: tribute, political submission, acknowledgement of Babylonian supremacy. King Jehoiakim of Judah complied. Initially, he had no good alternative. But within a few years, encouraged by promises of Egyptian support that proved illusory, Judah rebelled. Nebuchadnezzar's response was swift and thorough. In 597 BCE, he besieged Jerusalem, captured it, and carried off the king, the royal court, the military leadership, the craftsmen, and the temple treasures to Babylon. This was the first deportation of the Jewish population to Babylon, the beginning of what would be remembered in Jewish history as the Babylonian exile. A new king, Zedekiah, was installed as a Babylonian vassal, and he too, after years of uneasy submission, chose rebellion, again encouraged by Egyptian promises that again proved empty. This time, Nebuchadnezzar did not move quickly. He besieged Jerusalem for 18 months, a brutal siege that the Book of Lamentations describes with devastating eloquence, a text of grief for a city that is starving and dying, whose children are fainting in the streets, whose people are eating the bodies of the dead. In 586 BCE, Jerusalem fell. The Temple of Solomon, the first temple, the house of the God of Israel, was burned. Its treasures were carried to Babylon. The walls of Jerusalem were torn down. A large portion of the remaining Jewish population was deported to Babylon. Zedekiah was captured while trying to flee, and Nebuchadnezzar had his sons killed in front of him before having his eyes put out, so that the last thing he ever saw was the death of his children. He was then taken to Babylon in chains. This was not an unusual fate for a rebel king in the ancient Near East. Nebuchadnezzar treated captured rulers with consistent severity, but the destruction of Jerusalem and its temple had consequences that went far beyond the immediate military and political situation, because it forced the Jewish religious tradition into a crisis of belief that produced some of its most profound theological thinking. If God had allowed his temple to be destroyed, what did that mean? Had God abandoned his people? Had the people failed God? These were not questions with easy answers, and the attempt to find answers produced the prophetic literature of the Hebrew Scriptures, texts of extraordinary power and depth that wrestled with the problem of suffering and divine justice and the nature of covenant and the possibility of restoration. The book of Isaiah, the book of Jeremiah, the book of Ezekiel. These texts were written in whole or in part during the period of the Babylonian exile, and they are among the greatest literary and theological documents in human history. The exiles in Babylon did not simply disappear. They maintained their community. They maintained their religious practices, adapting them to circumstances that no longer included a temple, developing the synagogue as a place of communal prayer and study that did not require a physical sacred center. They maintained their identity with a fierceness born of the threat of losing it, and they observed the city they were living in. The Babylon they saw was not the monster of later Jewish and Christian tradition, not yet. It was, by the standards of the ancient world, a relatively tolerant place. The deportees were not enslaved. They were settled in communities, some of them quite comfortable, allowed to own property, to engage in trade, to practice their professions. The archives found by archaeologists in a site near Babylon contain records of a Jewish merchant community functioning actively in Babylonian commercial life, keeping meticulous accounts of their business dealings. The exile was a tragedy, but it was not an extermination. Psalm 137, which begins by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down and wept, when we remembered Zion, is one of the most beautiful and most heartbreaking poems in the Hebrew tradition. It is a poem of longing, of grief, of the specific ache of being far from home in a land that is not your own, even a land that is magnificent, even a land that is, by every external measure, extraordinary. The poem ends with a curse that is startling in its violence, a prayer for revenge against the captors, and yet the opening lines have the quality of truth, the quality of something that was actually felt, actually experienced, by real people sitting by real rivers in a real city, far from the one they called home. Babylon was, to the exiles, both their prison and their wonder. They hated it and could not look away from it. They despised its polytheism and marveled at its architecture. They longed to leave it, and, when they finally could, some of them stayed. The Jewish community in Babylon would remain a significant presence for centuries after the exile officially ended, a presence that shaped both Jewish and Babylonian culture in ways that are still being traced by scholars. Nebuchadnezzar died around 562 BCE, after a reign of 43 years. He had ruled Babylon at its absolute height, had built it into a city that the ancient world would remember for the rest of its history. What happened after his death is a story of rapid decline that is almost shocking in its speed. In the 23 years between Nebuchadnezzar's death and the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great of Persia, 4 different kings occupied the Babylonian throne. Only one of them, a man named Nabonidus, ruled for any significant length of time. The others were killed by rivals within months, or even weeks of taking power. Nabonidus is one of the most peculiar figures in ancient Near Eastern history, a man whose interests and priorities placed him so profoundly out of step with the expectations of his position that his reign became a kind of slow-motion political crisis. He was not, it appears, a military man by temperament. He was a devotee of the moon god Sin, whose principal temple was in the ancient city of Harran, in what is now southern Turkey. This was personally significant because his mother had been a priestess of Sin. But it was politically disastrous because it meant that his religious loyalties were not primarily to Marduk, the god of Babylon, the god whose priests controlled the city's most important religious institutions. The priests of Marduk needed a king who would perform the New Year festival, the Akitu, an elaborate series of rituals that renewed the king's divine mandate and established the proper relationship between the human and divine realms for the coming year. This was not optional. It was the cornerstone of Babylonian royal legitimacy. Nabonidus, for years, simply did not perform it. He went instead to the oasis of Tamar in Arabia, where he lived for a decade, apparently pursuing his religious interests and leaving his son Belshazzar in charge of Babylon. The precise reasons for this extraordinary absence remain debated. Some scholars believe Nabonidus was deliberately trying to reform Babylonian religion, to elevate Sin above Marduk in a kind of royal religious revolution. Others believe he was pursuing economic and strategic interests in Arabia, trying to control trade routes. Still others have seen psychological instability in his behavior. Whatever the reasons, the practical effect was that Babylon was ruled, for a decade, by a regent, while the king sat in an oasis far away, and the rituals that were supposed to maintain the proper order of the universe went unperformed. The Babylonian chronicles describe this period with a notable lack of enthusiasm for their king, and the priests of Marduk were, to put it mildly, not pleased. When the threat from the east materialized, when Cyrus the Great of Persia assembled his forces and turned them toward Babylon, the city was in a condition of political and religious dysfunction that made it far more vulnerable than its extraordinary walls would have suggested. Cyrus the Great is one of those figures in history who seems almost too good to be true. A conqueror who was genuinely benevolent, a king who built an empire by being kind to the people he conquered, a man whose historical reputation, even 2,500 years after his death, is better than the reputation of most political leaders who have ever lived. He was the founder of the Achaemenid Persian Empire, the first truly universal empire in world history, a political entity that at its greatest extent stretched from Greece in the west to the Indus River in the east, encompassing dozens of distinct peoples and cultures and languages. And he built it, or at least began it, in large part through a policy of religious tolerance and cultural respect that was genuinely unusual for the ancient world. In 550 BCE, Cyrus overthrew the Median Empire, the same Medes who had been allied with Nabopolassar in the destruction of Assyria. He then moved against Lydia in western Anatolia, whose king Croesus was famously the richest man in the world, a reputation that ended when Cyrus defeated him around 547 BCE. And then he turned his attention to Babylon. The military campaign against Babylon in 539 BCE was, by ancient standards, surprisingly quick. The decisive battle took place at Opis on the Tigris River, where the Persian forces defeated the Babylonian army. Shortly thereafter, the city of Sippar, just north of Babylon, fell without resistance, and then Babylon itself opened its gates. The ancient sources are not entirely consistent about what happened. One account suggests there was fighting. The Cyrus cylinder, a clay barrel inscription created by Cyrus or his scribes shortly after the conquest, presents a narrative in which Marduk himself invited Cyrus into Babylon, in which the god of Babylon chose the Persian king as his champion against the impious Nabonidus, in which the people of Babylon greeted Cyrus as a liberator. The Babylonian chronicles, which are more prosaic, suggest that the city fell with minimal resistance, but do not present the essentially miraculous narrative of the Cyrus cylinder. What is clear is that Cyrus entered Babylon without the destruction that had accompanied previous conquests of the city. He did not sack it, he did not carry off its gods, he did not enslave its population. He participated in the Babylonian religious festivals. He presented himself not as a conqueror, but as the legitimate king of Babylon, chosen by Marduk to restore the proper order that Nabonidus had disrupted. And he issued the Cyrus Cylinder, which is sometimes described as the first declaration of human rights in history, though that characterization is debated by scholars who note that its context was specifically political propaganda, rather than a general statement of principle. Whatever its nature, the cylinder records Cyrus's policy of allowing the peoples displaced by Babylonian policy to return to their homelands and to restore their religious practices. For the Jewish exiles in Babylon, this was the moment of liberation, the end of the Babylonian exile, recorded in the Book of Ezra in the Hebrew Scriptures as the decree of Cyrus permitting the return to Zion and the rebuilding of the temple. The return from Babylon was not, in reality, a single dramatic event. Many of the exiles had been in Babylon for decades and had built lives there. Many did not return. The community that did return found a Jerusalem in ruins and faced the enormous task of rebuilding. But the theological significance of the return, of the ending of the exile, and the possibility of the temple's reconstruction was enormous, and Cyrus became, uniquely among foreign rulers, a figure celebrated in the Hebrew Scriptures. The prophet Isaiah, in texts scholars believe were written during or shortly after the exile, calls Cyrus the Lord's anointed, the shepherd of the Lord who will fulfill his purpose. High praise from a tradition that was generally suspicious of Gentile kings. Babylon became the western capital of the Persian Empire. It was, in many ways, the most important city in the empire after Persepolis itself. The Persian kings maintained the Babylonian administrative traditions, supported the Babylonian temples, and continued the city's role as the commercial hub of the Near East. Babylon prospered under Persian rule, though it was not growing in the way it had grown under Nebuchadnezzar. It was maintaining rather than expanding. There were rebellions. In 522 BCE, and again in 521 BCE, Babylon revolted against Persian rule and had to be suppressed. Darius I, who became king after a contested succession, dealt harshly with these revolts. Later, in 484 BCE, another revolt during the reign of Xerxes was also suppressed, and Xerxes reportedly removed the great statue of Marduk from the Esagila, which was, in Babylonian religious terms, almost exactly what the destruction of the temple had been for the Jews. It struck at the heart of the city's sacred identity. But Babylon continued. It always continued. In 334 BCE, a young Macedonian king crossed the Hellespont into Asia with an army of 47,000 men and began one of the most extraordinary military campaigns in human history. His name was Alexander, and within a decade, he would conquer an empire larger than anything the world had previously seen. He arrived in Babylon in 331 BCE, following his defeat of the Persian king Darius III at the Battle of Gaugamela in what is now northern Iraq. The city did not resist him. The Persian satrap, the provincial governor, surrendered Babylon to Alexander, and the Macedonian king entered the city in the same way Cyrus had entered it a little over 2 centuries before, as a liberator and a restorer rather than a destroyer. Alexander's relationship with Babylon was one of genuine fascination. He was a student of Greek culture who had conquered the Persian world and found, to his surprise and perhaps his delight, that it was far more sophisticated and complex than the Greeks had given it credit for. Babylon, in particular, seems to have captivated him. He ordered the repair of the Esagila and the restoration of the ziggurat, which had fallen into disrepair. He participated in the Babylonian religious ceremonies. He was proclaimed King of Babylon and of Asia. When he died in Babylon in 323 BCE at the age of 32, of causes that have been debated ever since, whether fever, poisoning, alcoholism, or some combination, he died in the palace of Nebuchadnezzar. He died in the greatest city in the world, in a room that had been built by a man who had ruled it a quarter of a millennium before. There is something in that image that is hard to shake. The young man who had conquered everything, dying in a room that belonged to someone else's empire, in a city that had outlasted every conqueror who had ever tried to claim it. Alexander had no son, or rather, his son was unborn at his death. What he had was a collection of generals, each extraordinarily capable, each with his own ambitions, and they tore his empire apart almost immediately. This period of conflict between Alexander's successors, called the Wars of the Diadochi, was brutal and prolonged. Babylon was fought over multiple times in the decades after Alexander's death. It changed hands repeatedly. It was besieged, captured, briefly held, lost again. One of Alexander's generals, Seleucus, eventually established control over the eastern portion of the empire, including Mesopotamia, and founded the Seleucid dynasty. Under the Seleucids, Babylon faced a new and in some ways more insidious challenge than military conquest. It faced competition. Seleucus founded a new city called Seleucia on the Tigris River, not far from Babylon, and he made it his capital. He deliberately encouraged people to move from Babylon to Seleucia, offering economic incentives and administrative advantages. For Babylon, which had always attracted population through its prestige and its opportunities, this was a kind of slow draining. Gradually, over decades, people left. The city's population shrank. It did not die. Even reduced, Babylon was still a major city, still home to the great temples, still a center of learning and religious practice, still a place where the astronomical observations that Babylonian scholars had been making for centuries continued to be made. Babylonian astronomy, in particular, achieved some of its greatest results during the Seleucid period, with mathematical models of planetary motion that were not surpassed until the early modern period in Europe. The Babylonian astronomical diaries, meticulously kept records of celestial observations going back centuries, are among the most extraordinary scientific documents of the ancient world. But the city was contracting. The population that had once numbered in the hundreds of thousands was declining. Buildings were falling into disrepair and not being rebuilt. The Euphrates, always a restless river, was shifting its course in ways that made irrigation more difficult and flooding more of a problem. The trade routes that had once converged on Babylon were increasingly bypassing it in favor of Seleucia and other new cities. The great city was, for the first time in its history, genuinely diminishing. Not destroyed by a conqueror, not struck by catastrophe, just shrinking, quietly and steadily, as the world that had made it great moved on to other centers, other priorities, other cities. By the 1st century CE, the city that had been the wonder of the ancient world was largely empty. Not entirely. The great temples seem to have remained active, in a reduced way, into at least the 1st century BCE. There is evidence of continued Babylonian religious and astronomical practice into the Parthian period, after the Seleucids were replaced by the Parthian Empire from the east. But the city as a functioning urban center, as the commercial and cultural hub it had been under Nebuchadnezzar, was gone. The geographer Strabo, writing in the late 1st century BCE, noted that Babylon had become so depopulated that he could say without exaggeration that a great desert had been made of it. The historian Diodorus Siculus, writing around the same time, described the great walls still standing, but the city within them abandoned. Later writers would note that the ruins had been used as a hunting park, a place where kings came to chase wild animals among the broken remnants of palaces that had once received the ambassadors of the world. The Euphrates eventually moved west, as rivers in flat plains tend to do over time, and without the river, the remaining agricultural activity in the area became increasingly difficult. The city was not buried by a volcano, like Pompeii. It was not swept away by a flood. It simply emptied out, over centuries, as its population found better opportunities elsewhere, and the great buildings that no one was maintaining began, under the pressure of rain and wind and time, to return to the earth from which they had been made. Because Babylonian buildings were made of mud brick, even the great palace of Nebuchadnezzar, even the walls that the ancient world had thought were impregnable, they were mud brick, the same material that had been used in Mesopotamia since the very beginning of architecture in the region. Because it was what was available, because stone is scarce in the flat valley between the rivers. Mud brick, when maintained, is remarkably durable. The Babylonians knew how to make it last, but mud brick, when abandoned, dissolves. Rain softens it, roots split it, wind erodes it. Over centuries, the great walls of Babylon came down, not because anyone tore them down, though some later inhabitants certainly robbed the brick from fallen sections, but because nothing is permanent in the face of enough time. By the medieval period, the site of Babylon was known to local people simply as the Hilla region, a collection of low mounds and rubble fields on a plain near a bend in the Euphrates. The name Babylon survived in a corrupted form in the Arabic geographical tradition, but as a geographical reference rather than a living memory. The stories of the great city were preserved in the religious texts that had been written about it, in the Hebrew scriptures, in the Greek and Roman literary tradition, in the emerging Islamic tradition that drew on both of those. But the actual city, the physical place, was as forgotten as a dream. The rediscovery of Babylon was a gradual process that began in the early modern period and accelerated dramatically in the 19th century. European travelers to the Ottoman Empire and Persia had been noting the mounds of southern Iraq since at least the 16th century and speculating about their identity. Pietro della Valle, an Italian traveler who visited the region in the early 17th century, correctly identified one of the mounds as the site of ancient Babylon and brought back inscribed bricks from the ruins, the first Babylonian artifacts to reach Europe. But systematic archaeological investigation had to wait for the development of the discipline itself. The first serious excavations at Babylon were conducted by Claudius James Rich, a British East India Company official stationed in Baghdad, who surveyed and mapped the site in 1811 and again in 1817. His work, published in several reports, was the first systematic description of the ruins and sparked considerable interest in Europe. Rich did not excavate in the modern sense. He walked the site, made measurements, collected artifacts from the surface, and wrote careful descriptions of what he saw. But his work established that the mounds were indeed the remains of a great ancient city, consistent with the biblical and classical descriptions of Babylon. The first major excavations were conducted by a French team under Fresnel and Oppert in the 1850s, though they were cut short by political difficulties and natural disasters. The Great German Excavation, led by Robert Koldewey for the Deutsche Orientgesellschaft, began in 1899 and continued for nearly 2 decades, until the First World War forced its suspension in 1917. Koldewey's excavation was the most systematic and productive ever conducted at Babylon. He uncovered the processional way, the Ishtar Gate, the Southern Palace, the Esagila Temple Complex, residential neighborhoods, and a vast quantity of artifacts that transformed understanding of the city. The Ishtar Gate that Koldewey excavated was not standing, it had collapsed, and what remained were thousands of glazed brick fragments, many still brilliantly colored despite their long burial, lying in the debris of the gateway's walls and towers. These fragments were carefully removed, catalogued, and shipped to Berlin, where they were eventually reconstructed in the Pergamon Museum, where the gate stands today in something approaching its original form. It is one of the most remarkable objects in any museum in the world. To stand before it is to have a genuine encounter with Babylon, with the actual surface of the actual gateway that the people of ancient Babylon touched and passed through and looked at every day of their lives. Koldewey also found the great throne room of Nebuchadnezzar's palace, its walls still bearing traces of the blue and yellow glazed brick decoration that had made it one of the most opulent spaces in the ancient world. He found the vaulted substructure of the Northern Palace, which he initially believed might be the foundation of the Hanging Gardens, though subsequent analysis has not confirmed this. He found inscriptions, tablets, artifacts of daily life, administrative records, religious texts. What he found, in aggregate, was not just a city. He found the physical record of a civilization. The 20th century was not kind to Babylon. The First World War brought British forces to the region, and their military occupation of the site, while not as destructive as might have been feared, did cause damage to exposed remains that Koldewey's team had partially excavated. The development of modern Iraq brought agricultural activity and construction to the area around the site that affected the preservation conditions for the buried remains. But the most deliberate damage to Babylon came in the 1980s, when the Iraqi president Saddam Hussein undertook a massive reconstruction project at the site that was as archaeologically disastrous as it was politically motivated. Saddam saw himself as the heir to Nebuchadnezzar, a Mesopotamian great man restoring the glory of his ancestors. He had his name stamped on bricks used in reconstructions, just as Nebuchadnezzar had done 2.5 millennia before. He built a modern palace on a hill overlooking the ancient ruins. He had walls rebuilt, sometimes directly on top of unexcavated ancient remains, and not with any archaeological sensitivity, but with new brick that obscured and destroyed what was beneath it. The result was a site that is, in places, a palimpsest of authentic ancient remains, 19th century German excavation backfill, and 20th century reconstruction that is difficult to untangle. Archaeologists who work at Babylon today must navigate this layered damage as they try to understand what the city actually looked like. It is frustrating work, made more complicated by the damage done during the 2003 Iraq War, when a coalition military base was established at Babylon, and military vehicles and construction equipment caused further damage to the delicate archaeological surface. Babylon was designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 2019, which offers some protection and recognition going forward. But the damage of the past century cannot be undone. What exists at Babylon today is both more and less than what was there. More, in the sense that reconstruction has made some features visible that would otherwise require imagination. Less, in the sense that irreplaceable evidence has been destroyed. And yet, the site still holds wonders. The Ishtar Gate's original foundations are still there, below the reconstruction visible to visitors. The processional way still runs its ancient course. The outline of the Esagila is still discernible. The great plain around the ruins still has the quality that those who visit it almost universally describe. The quality of immensity, of having been in the presence of something that was once unimaginably large and important. The mounds are patient. They keep their secrets and reveal them slowly, and even in their damaged, partial, compromised state, they are unmistakably what they are. They are the ruins of the greatest city of the ancient world. There is a moment in the book of Daniel, one of the latest books in the Hebrew scriptures, written probably in the 2nd century BCE, though set in the time of the Babylonian exile, when Nebuchadnezzar stands on the roof of his palace and surveys his city, and he says, in the text, "Is not this great Babylon, that I have built for the house of the kingdom by the might of my power, and for the honor of my majesty?" It is a moment of pride that the text immediately punishes, because in the very next verse, a voice from heaven announces that Nebuchadnezzar will be driven from among men, and shall eat grass like an ox, and be wet with the dew of heaven, and live in this degraded state for 7 years, until he learns that the Most High rules in the kingdom of men. The pride that built Babylon, the text suggests, is the pride that destroys its builder. This is a religious interpretation of pride and power, and it reflects the specific theological perspective of the text's authors, who had reasons to view Babylonian hubris with a critical eye. But there is something in the moment itself, in Nebuchadnezzar's imagined survey of his city, that transcends the theological frame, because what he was looking at was real. The walls were real, the temples were real, the great processional way with its roaring lions in glazed brick was real. The ziggurat rising 90 meters above the flat plain was real. The city of 200,000 people, the workshops and the markets and the schools and the palaces and the gardens, all of it was real. He had built it. Or rather, his dynasty had built it, and his people had built it, over centuries of accumulated labor and ambition and craft and devotion. And standing on the roof of his palace looking at it, he could not have been wrong to feel something enormous. Something that the word pride is probably too small for. Something closer to awe. The kind of awe that comes from being in the presence of a thing that is larger than any single person. A thing that has taken on its own life, that has become more than the sum of its parts. Because that is what cities are. They are the largest things that human beings make. Larger than any palace, larger than any temple, larger than any work of art. They are collaborative, multi-generational, improvisational structures that accumulate meaning over time and become, eventually, something that feels almost inevitable, almost natural, almost as if they had always been there and always would be. And then they end, and their ending is almost impossible to believe. Babylon ended. The Hanging Gardens, if they existed, crumbled and were swallowed by the earth. The ziggurat, whose top once seemed to touch the sky, collapsed into a mound. The great walls, which 2 chariots could pass side by side on top of, dissolved in the rain. The Ishtar Gate, with its dragons and its bulls in brilliant blue and gold, fell and was buried. The statue of Marduk, around which the entire sacred order of the city had been organized for centuries, was carried off and melted down or lost. The markets fell silent, the streets emptied, the schools closed, and the river moved. The Euphrates, which had given Babylon everything, which had been the reason it existed, the reason its soil was rich, and its trade was possible, and its irrigation worked, and its people could eat, shifted its course over the millennia until it no longer ran where it once ran. The city that had been built where the water was found itself stranded without the water that had built it. This is, in its way, the most complete ruin. Not destruction, but abandonment. Not a dramatic end, but a slow unwinding. Cities that are destroyed can be rebuilt, and Babylon was rebuilt more than once. But cities that are abandoned have made a different kind of statement. They have said that the world has moved on, that the conditions that once made this particular place the center of things no longer obtain, that the river is elsewhere now. We stand, 26 centuries after Nebuchadnezzar, in a world that would be unrecognizable to him in almost every particular, and yet certain things persist. The cuneiform tablets that his scribes wrote are still being read by scholars today, their wedge-shaped signs, pressed into clay, still legible to those trained to interpret them. The astronomical observations that his predecessors made are still incorporated into the mathematical traditions that eventually became modern astronomy. The legal principles that Hammurabi codified still echo, distantly but recognizably, in the legal traditions of cultures that had no direct contact with ancient Babylon. The stories of the great city, the wonder and the terror of it, live on in texts that billions of people still read and revere. And the word Babylon has been applied to cities in every age and every language. From the Babylon of the Book of Revelation, which probably meant Rome, to the Babylon of Rastafarian tradition, which means the oppressive Western system. It has been used to evoke excess, decadence, magnificence, spiritual corruption, worldly glory. It has been a symbol and a metaphor and a stand-in and a warning. It has been used by people who knew nothing concrete about the historical city, but felt, in the word itself, the weight of something enormous. This is not nothing. This is, in its way, a form of persistence that outlasts even the stones. The city of mud brick dissolved back into mud. But the idea of the city, the shadow it cast on the imagination of humanity, is still here, still legible, still meaning something. Still, in whatever sense the word can apply to ruins and legends, alive. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you might carry with you some image from this long story. Perhaps the walls of Babylon rising from the flat plain, those impossible walls that made the ancient world stop and stare. Perhaps the lions on the processional way, their rock crystal eyes catching the light of torches 2,500 years ago. Perhaps the ziggurat, that mountain made of human hands and human ambition, lifting its apex toward a sky that was full of stars, the Babylonian astronomers were carefully and patiently mapping. Perhaps the river, always the river. The Euphrates still runs. It runs through the flat valley of southern Iraq, past towns and farms, and the low mounds that were once the greatest city in the world. It has shifted from where it ran in Nebuchadnezzar's time, as rivers do, but it runs. The water that gave Babylon everything still moves through the land that Babylon came from and returned to. The water is older than the city. It was there before the first settlement on the riverbank, before the first mud brick was laid, before the first name was given to the place where the river curved and the soil was rich and the air smelled of the possibility of things. And the water will be there long after the last trace of Babylon has been mapped and studied and interpreted and written about and remembered and finally, eventually, forgotten entirely. Not yet. Not yet. There is still so much to say, so much that the tablets have preserved, so much that the stones remember, so much that the dust of that flat plain still holds. But tonight, that is enough. Tonight, let Babylon rest. Let the great walls stand in whatever darkness you can imagine for them. Let the lions process down the processional way one more time, their glazed eyes bright in the torchlight. Let the ziggurat rise against the stars that the astronomers of Babylon watched and named and tracked through their careful, precise, beautiful centuries of observation. Let the city sleep, as cities do, when the night comes and the streets are quiet and the fires are banked and the river moves in the dark, indifferent and ancient, through the flat valley where civilization first learned to call itself by name. This has been a history for sleep production. Thank you for spending these hours in Babylon. Sleep well. The mathematics of heaven. We have been speaking of Babylon as a city of power and commerce, of walls and markets and kings and wars. But there is another Babylon, one that lived not in the streets and palaces, but in the rooms where men sat at night and watched the sky. The Babylonian astronomical tradition is, without exaggeration, one of the great intellectual achievements of human history. It is also one of the most poorly understood because the cuneiform tablets on which it was recorded spent centuries in the ground and centuries more in museum storerooms before scholars trained to read them began to understand what they actually contained. What they contained was a systematic, mathematical description of the heavens that had no parallel in the ancient world until the Greeks, and that, in some respects, remained without parallel until the early modern period. It began with observation. For centuries, going back at least to the old Babylonian period of Hammurabi and perhaps before, Babylonian scribes kept records of celestial events. They noted when planets rose and set. They recorded lunar eclipses and solar eclipses. They marked the positions of the moon and the planets against the background of the stars. They noted unusual phenomena, comets, meteor showers, halos around the moon. All of this was recorded in what scholars now call the astronomical diaries, cuneiform tablets that document celestial observations, sometimes night by night, year by year, over a span of several centuries. The diaries are not just scientific documents, they are also historical documents, because Babylonian scholars believed, with considerable sophistication, that celestial phenomena were omens, signs of what was to come in the earthly realm. A particular kind of eclipse might foretell trouble for a king. The appearance of a certain planet in a certain position might indicate the likely outcome of a military campaign. This connection between astronomy and divination, between the observation of the sky and the interpretation of the future, is sometimes used to dismiss Babylonian astronomy as primitive or as not really science. This is a mistake. The two activities were connected in Babylonian thought, but the astronomical observation was systematic and rigorous in ways that the divination was not, and the mathematical astronomy that developed from the observational tradition was entirely independent of its divinatory motivations. By the later periods, by the Neo-Babylonian and Seleucid periods, Babylonian astronomers had developed mathematical models of planetary motion that are genuinely astonishing. They could predict the positions of the moon and the planets with a precision that, for most practical purposes, was sufficient. They had identified the periodicity of the moon's motion, the Saros cycle, a period of approximately 18 years, after which lunar eclipses repeat in essentially the same pattern. They had developed arithmetical procedures for calculating the positions of Jupiter and Venus and Saturn that have been described by modern historians of science as the first examples of mathematical physics, models that describe the behavior of physical phenomena using quantitative mathematical methods. This is not primitive. this is sophisticated. This is, in the history of science, a genuine step forward, a contribution to human understanding that was made in the rooms of the Esagila temple complex and the scribal schools of Babylon by men who sat by the light of oil lamps and pressed their observations into clay tablets with reed styluses, night after night, year after year, for centuries. Some of these mathematical methods were eventually transmitted to the Greeks, and through the Greeks to the later European tradition, which forms the ancestry of modern science. The degree of this transmission is debated by historians of science, but it is clear that Greek astronomers of the Hellenistic period knew of Babylonian astronomical work and used some of it. Hipparchus, in the 2nd century BCE, appears to have drawn on Babylonian records and methods. Ptolemy, in the 2nd century CE, whose Almagest was the definitive astronomical text in the European and Islamic traditions for over 1,000 years, incorporated Babylonian observational data. So when you look at a modern astronomy textbook, when you read about the Saros cycle or about the methods astronomers use to track planetary motion, you are, at a considerable remove and through many intermediaries, looking at the work of men who lived in Babylon 2,500 years ago, who sat on temple rooftops on clear nights in the flat valley between the rivers and watched the stars move. Babylon built the walls. Babylon wrote the laws. Babylon told the stories that shaped 3 of the world's great religions. And Babylon watched the sky patiently and precisely, and recorded what it saw, and what it calculated, and what it understood. That is a legacy. The city of stories. One more thing must be said about Babylon, and it is perhaps the most important thing of all, because it concerns not the city that was built of brick, but the city that was built of words. Babylon is the setting for stories that are still told, not just mentioned, not just referenced, but actually told, read, studied, debated, preached about, painted, filmed, set to music. The accumulated narrative weight of Babylon in the world's storytelling traditions is extraordinary, and it reflects something real about what the city meant to those who knew it and those who imagined it. The Babylonian exile produced, as we have noted, some of the most profound texts in the Hebrew literary tradition, but it also produced something that shaped the entire subsequent narrative of Babylon in Western consciousness, which is the image of Babylon as the enemy, the oppressor, the city of wickedness, the antithesis of Jerusalem, and everything Jerusalem represented. This image was not entirely fair to the historical city, which was, as cities go, neither more nor less morally complicated than any other large, powerful, cosmopolitan urban centre. But it was enormously influential, because the texts in which it appears were read and revered by billions of people over 2.5 millennia. The Book of Revelation's description of Babylon as the great whore, the mother of harlots and abominations, seated on the beast with 7 heads, is one of the most vivid passages in the entire biblical canon. It is, most scholars believe, a coded description of Rome, using Babylon as a cipher for a city of overwhelming power and luxury and corruption. But the coding worked because Babylon was the perfect symbol. Everyone who read it knew, viscerally, what Babylon meant. They had read the Psalms, they had read Daniel, they had read Isaiah. They knew what Babylon was. This tradition of Babylon as the city of excess and spiritual corruption continued through the medieval period and into the modern. When William Blake wrote of dark satanic mills in his poem Jerusalem, he was drawing on a tradition in which Babylon represented the industrial, the mechanical, the spiritually dead, the city that had forgotten what cities were supposed to be for. When Rastafarian tradition, developed among poor black Jamaicans in the 20th century, used Babylon to describe the oppressive structures of Western capitalism and white supremacy, they were tapping into the same deep symbolic reservoir, the same instinct that Babylon meant the worldly power that holds the spiritual community captive. But alongside this tradition of condemnation, there runs another tradition, equally ancient and in some ways more interesting, which is the tradition of wonder. The ancient sources that describe Babylon are not uniformly hostile. Many of them are simply astonished. Herodotus, the Greek historian, who may or may not have visited the city in the 5th century BCE, describes it in terms that are unambiguously admiring. He describes the walls, the processional way, the temples, the Tower of Babel, and he does so with the evident delight of a man confronting something he never expected to be so impressive. He may have gotten some details wrong, ancient historians frequently did, but the quality of wonder in his description is genuine. And there is the Epic of Gilgamesh. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest literary narrative we have. It was written in Babylonian cuneiform, though it draws on older Sumerian sources, and it tells the story of Gilgamesh, the king of the city of Uruk, who is 2/3 divine and 1/3 human, who is the strongest and most magnificent king in the world, and who cannot accept the fact that he is going to die. The story of Gilgamesh is about many things. It is about friendship, specifically the friendship between Gilgamesh and his companion Enkidu, who begins as his enemy and becomes the person who makes his life make sense. It is about adventure, because Gilgamesh and Enkidu go on journeys and fight monsters and face gods. It is about grief, because Enkidu dies, and Gilgamesh's grief is so total and so overwhelming that it drives him across the world in search of the secret of immortality. And it is about failure, because he does not find it. Or rather, he finds the plant of immortality and then loses it to a serpent while he sleeps. And he returns to his city, to Uruk, and stands before its walls and looks at what he has built and understands, finally, that this is what he has. Not immortality, not eternal life, but this, the city, the walls his hands helped build, the people who live behind them, the stories they will tell about him when he is gone. Gilgamesh went, he returned, he was weary. He carved his story on a stone tablet. He looked at the walls of Uruk, walls of fired brick, and their inner construction. He laid eyes on the great terrace. He saw the ancient tablet box of cedar and opened its bronze lock. He pulled out the tablet of lapis lazuli and read it out loud. The Epic of Gilgamesh survived in various versions throughout the history of Babylonian literature, and when the library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal was excavated at Nineveh in the 19th century, tablets containing the epic were found, giving modern readers access for the first time to this extraordinary story. It has been translated repeatedly and continuously since then, and it has found new readers in every generation, because the story it tells is not really about ancient Mesopotamia. It is about being human, about the fear of death, about the consolation of friendship, about the way that love and loss reshape us, about the strange comfort of standing in front of something we helped build, and understanding that this, however transient, however fragile, however destined to become ruins, is what it means to have been here. Babylon appears in Gilgamesh, not as the setting, since the story is set in Uruk, but Babylon is the tradition in which the story was told and retold and preserved and transmitted. Babylon is the city whose scribes copied it and studied it and added to it and interpreted it. Babylon is the tradition that gave us the story of a man who could not accept mortality and learned, in the end, that the walls he had built were enough. There is something in that feels like more than coincidence. That the city which has left the deepest mark on the human imagination is also the city that preserved the first story about what it means to be a mortal creature, building things in the face of impermanence. That Babylon, the city that rose so high and fell so completely, kept the story of Gilgamesh standing before the walls of Uruk and understanding finally what those walls were for, the long shadow. Babylon has been ending for 25 centuries, and it is still not entirely gone. The tablets are still being deciphered. The site is still being excavated, carefully, by teams of archaeologists from Iraq and from around the world, who understand what is there and what has been lost, and what might still be recovered. The texts are still being translated, interpreted, and reinterpreted, and every generation of scholars finds things in them that previous generations missed. The city has left its shadow on the languages we speak. The division of the hour into 60 minutes and the minute into 60 seconds is a Babylonian legacy, preserved through the Greek astronomical tradition. The names of the days of the week in many languages are derived ultimately from the Babylonian system of planetary associations. The zodiac, the 12 constellations along the path of the sun through the sky, was formalized by Babylonian astronomers. The concept of zero, or at least one version of it, was developed here. The idea that law should be written down and publicly displayed so that everyone can know what it is. That law is not just the word of the powerful, but a system with its own logic and its own standards, traces a line back to the stele of Hammurabi. These are not simply interesting historical curiosities. They are the furniture of the mind, the structures within which we think, without which our thinking would be different and, in some cases, impossible. We do not notice them because they are so embedded in how we experience the world that they seem natural, given, inevitable. They are not. They were made. They were made here, in this city, on the Euphrates, by people who were trying to solve problems and organize their society and understand the world around them, and the solutions they found were good enough and flexible enough and useful enough to be carried forward through every upheaval and every transformation that the world has undergone since. Babylon built things that outlasted the city. That is the highest form of construction. The walls fell, the ziggurat dissolved, the statue of Marduk is gone, melted down perhaps by Xerxes, lost entirely. But the systems, the ideas, the stories, the ways of organizing thought and time and law and the observation of the sky, these are still here. This is what it means to say that civilization is cumulative. It does not mean that every generation preserves everything. It does not mean that nothing is lost, because enormous amounts are lost. And the loss of Babylon specifically represents one of the great cultural catastrophes in human history, the loss of languages and texts and traditions and knowledge that will never be recovered. But it does mean that some things are carried forward, sometimes consciously and sometimes without anyone knowing where they came from, sometimes transformed beyond recognition, and sometimes preserved with remarkable fidelity. We carry Babylon with us. We always have. What Nebuchadnezzar knew. There is a question that hovers over all of this, and it is the question of whether the people who built Babylon knew what they were doing, not in the technical sense. Of course they knew what they were doing. They were competent builders and administrators and scholars. They understood irrigation and brickmaking and astronomical observation and commercial accounting. They were, in their fields, often extraordinarily capable. But did they know that what they were building would last? Not the buildings themselves, but the idea, the shadow, the influence that would still be traceable 25 centuries after the city fell silent. We cannot know what any of them thought about permanence and legacy. We have some evidence. Nebuchadnezzar's own inscriptions, the royal proclamations pressed into the bricks of his buildings and carved into stone monuments, are explicitly concerned with permanence. He invokes Marduk's protection for his buildings. He asks that they last forever. He builds to outlast himself, to outlast his dynasty, to outlast anything a single human life can witness. This desire for permanence is one of the most consistent themes in the royal inscriptions of ancient Mesopotamia, going back to the Sumerians. Every king wants his buildings to stand forever. Every king invokes the god's protection for his works. Every king builds as if building against time itself. And of course, they all failed. None of the buildings stood forever. None of them outlasted time. The walls of Babylon, which were built to be impregnable, dissolved in the rain. The ziggurat, which was built to connect the human world to the divine one, collapsed into a mound. The palace of Nebuchadnezzar, in whose rooms Alexander the Great died, is now a collection of foundations and reconstructed walls that requires a certain act of imagination to read as a palace at all. And yet, something did last. Not the stone, not the brick, not the physical structure, but the idea of what the city was and what it meant and what it represented. The shadow, the story, the weight of the name. Maybe this is enough. Maybe this is what permanence actually looks like. Not the survival of the physical object, but the survival of the meaning that the object carried. The walls of Babylon are gone. But the fact of the walls, the knowledge of them, the image of them in the minds of everyone who has ever heard the word Babylon, is still here. The statue of Marduk is gone, but Marduk himself, as a name and an idea and a symbol, persists in the texts that described him. The great city is gone, but the idea of the great city, the archetype of the magnificent, excessive, overwhelming, transformative, dangerous, wonderful, impossible city, is still with us, and Babylon is its original. Nebuchadnezzar stood on his roof and looked at his city and said, "Is not this great Babylon?" The text that preserves this moment is still being read. The question is still being asked. The city that prompted it is still, in the ways that matter most, there. Returning to the beginning, we began with two worlds. The world of the ruins, the flat sun-scorched plain in southern Iraq where the wind moves across crumbled walls and the dust settles into the outlines of ancient streets. And the world of the idea, the Babylon that lives in holy texts and imaginations and metaphors and the collective memory of a civilization that was shaped in ways it cannot fully articulate by everything this city was and did and built and destroyed and preserved. I want to return to both of them briefly as we near the end of our long night together. The physical site of Babylon today is a complicated place. There are visitors, mostly Iraqi citizens, who come to walk the reconstructed streets and look at the rebuilt portions of the Ishtar Gate and try to imagine what the city was. The reconstructions are controversial among archaeologists because they are not authentic and because they were done without sufficient attention to what was beneath them. But they give visitors something to see, and that matters too, because to see nothing is also a kind of failure, a failure to make the past visible to the present. There are the mounds, the patient, low mounds, rising from the plain all around the reconstructed area. The mounds are the real Babylon, or as close to it as we can get. They contain the remains of houses and workshops and temples and streets that have not been seen since the city emptied out 2,000 years ago. They contain tablets, perhaps thousands of them, still unexcavated, still holding information about Babylonian life and thought and commerce and scholarship that we do not yet have. They are a library buried in the earth, waiting. And there is the Euphrates, still running nearby, still brown and wide and carrying the silt from the mountains down to the sea, as it has done since before the first human being decided that this bend in the river, this rich flat land, would be a good place to build something. The world of the idea is harder to point to because it is everywhere. It is in every library that contains the Hebrew scriptures. It is in every museum that displays Babylonian artifacts. It is in every astronomy textbook that uses sexagesimal mathematics. It is in every legal system that assumes that law should be written down and publicly accessible. It is in every story about a great city that falls, every meditation on human ambition and its consequences, every poem about exile and longing and the strange grief of being far from home. It is in the word itself. Babylon, say it slowly. Let it sit in your mouth for a moment. 4,000 years of accumulated meaning in 2 syllables. 4,000 years of wonder and terror and awe and condemnation and longing and loss compressed into a word that anyone who speaks English or French or German or Arabic or Hebrew or a dozen other languages recognizes instantly, even if they could not tell you a single concrete fact about the city it came from. That is what it means to be the greatest city of the ancient world. Not to win every war, not to produce the most perfect buildings, or the most powerful army, or the most just laws, but to matter so much, to so many people, for so long, that the name outlasts the city itself by 25 centuries and is still not done. Babylon is still not done. Tonight, you have walked through it. You have heard the water of the Euphrates, and the wind off the plain, and the sound of the market, and the chant of the priests in the temple of Marduk. You have looked at the lions on the processional way, their eyes bright in the torchlight. You have stood beneath the ziggurat and felt the sky press down on the flat land around it. You have heard the laws read aloud in the square and watched the scribes in the schools press their signs into wet clay and the astronomers on the temple roof track the planets through the clear, brilliant, ancient night. You have been in Babylon, now rest. The river runs on in the dark, the mounds are patient, the tablets in the earth wait for the scholars who will come for them. The stars that the Babylonian astronomers mapped are still overhead, moving in the cycles those patient watchers described. Everything that was built here will be built again, someday, somewhere, by people who do not know. They are following paths that were laid down in this flat valley between these two rivers, in a city whose name was the Gate of the Gods. Sleep well, Babylon will be here when you wake. End of script. Echo. Expansion added. Checking new character count. WC, C, Home, Claude, Babylon, Script, Text, The Kings in the Dark. We have moved through Babylon's history in broad strokes, following the great arc from the first settlement on the riverbank to the emptied ruins of the 1st century CE. But history is not made of arcs. It is made of specific moments, specific people, specific days, when a decision was taken, or a building rose, or a star was recorded in a clay tablet. Let us return, briefly, to some of those moments, to the texture of life in the city that was, and not only the story of the city that rose and fell. Consider the scribal schools. They were called the Aduba in Sumerian, the House of Tablets, and they were among the most important institutions in Babylonian society, the places where the knowledge of civilization was preserved and transmitted from one generation to the next. In them, boys from good families spent years learning the cuneiform script, which was enormously complex, requiring mastery of hundreds of different signs in various configurations. The curriculum also included mathematics, literature, law, astronomy, the hymns of the gods, the great narratives like the Epic of Gilgamesh and the Enuma Elish, the Babylonian creation myth. We know something about what life in these schools was like, because some of the practice tablets have survived. They include not just the expected exercises in script and calculation, but also compositions by students describing their school days, and these descriptions are unexpectedly vivid. A student writes about arriving late to school and being beaten, about being called on to read aloud and stumbling over the signs and being beaten again, about the lunch his mother packed for him, about his hatred of a particular teacher, about the day he finally mastered a difficult passage and felt, for a moment, the pride of knowing something. The specificity of these moments is startling. Across 3,500 years, we are reading the complaints of a Babylonian schoolboy who hated getting in trouble and loved his mother's cooking. The universality of that experience, the sheer human familiarity of it, is one of the gifts that Babylonian civilization has left us. It is not just the great kings and the monumental buildings that survive. It is also the small, embarrassed, ordinary people who lived their days in the shadow of those buildings and wrote about them on the clay that the earth has kept for us. Consider the merchants. The commercial life of Babylon has left an extensive record in the clay tablets that have been found in various locations, including an extraordinary archive from the city of Nippur that covers the business activities of a single Babylonian Jewish merchant family, the Murashu family, over several generations. The Murashu archive gives us a detailed picture of commercial life in the 5th century BCE during the Achaemenid Persian period, and it is a picture of astonishing sophistication. The Murashu family operated as financial intermediaries, essentially bankers and brokers who managed agricultural estates and canal irrigation rights on behalf of Persian nobles and absentee landowners. They collected rents, arranged loans, managed labor contracts, dealt in a variety of commodities. Their records include contracts, receipts, and correspondence that document hundreds of individual transactions. And what these documents reveal is a commercial world that, in its complexity and its instruments, would not seem entirely alien to a modern business person. They used credit. They used complex contracts with multiple parties. They managed risk across a portfolio of assets. They negotiated in multiple commodities and multiple currencies, because the ancient world did not have a single currency system, but a complex web of different standards and exchange rates. They operated in a legal environment sophisticated enough to give their contracts binding force and to provide mechanisms for resolving disputes. This was not a primitive economy. This was a market economy of considerable sophistication, operating in the middle of the first millennium BCE, in the shadow of the Great Walls of Babylon, in a world that people in later centuries would dismiss as simply ancient. The people who kept these records and conducted these transactions were not primitive. They were participants in a complex, interconnected, globalized, or at least regionally integrated economic system that had been developing for 2,000 years. Consider the temple women. The temples of Babylon, like the temples of much of ancient Mesopotamia, had complex communities of dedicated personnel attached to them. Among these were women who held a variety of titles and played a variety of roles, from priestesses of the highest rank, who might be daughters of kings, to women of lower status, who performed various services for the temple institution. The details of these roles are still being clarified by scholars, and older interpretations that characterized many of these women as simply sacred prostitutes are now recognized as based on misunderstandings of the ancient evidence. The reality was more varied and more complex. What is clear is that the temples of Babylon were not just religious institutions. They were economic entities, major landowners and employers, centers of production and distribution. The Great Temple of Marduk controlled agricultural estates outside the city and employed hundreds, if not thousands, of people in various capacities. The temple was, in a very real sense, a state within the state, with its own resources, its own personnel, its own interests, and its own political influence. The high priest of Marduk was one of the most powerful figures in Babylon, a political actor as much as a religious one, whose cooperation the king needed and whose opposition could be dangerous. This complexity, this interlocking of religious and economic and political power, was not unique to Babylon. It was characteristic of ancient urban civilization generally. But Babylon, as the largest and most powerful city in the region for such a long period, developed these interlocking systems to a degree that left detailed records and that influenced the development of similar institutions throughout the region. Consider a single night, any night. Let us say a night in the middle of Nebuchadnezzar's reign, perhaps around 575 BCE, when the city was at its height and everything that it was going to be was already there. It is late. The markets have closed. The last of the merchants have locked their storerooms and gone home. The processional way is quiet, except for the night watch, soldiers who walk the length of it in slow, measured steps, their torches casting orange light on the glazed lions that watch from both sides with their rock crystal eyes. In the Temple of Marduk, the night priests are performing the rituals that are performed every night without fail, the offerings and the prayers and the songs that maintain the relationship between the city and its god. In the scribal school, the clay tablets from the day's lessons have been carefully stacked and are drying in the darkness. In the astronomical observatory at the top of the temple complex, two scholars are sitting side by side, wrapped in cloaks against the night wind, their reed styluses ready, their eyes fixed on a particular part of the sky where Jupiter is rising. They have been watching Jupiter for years. Their predecessors have been watching it for generations. They know exactly where it should be tonight, if their calculations are correct. They watch, they calculate, they press their observations into the wet clay. Below them, the city breathes, the river moves, the children are asleep, the dogs are quiet. The bread for tomorrow is set to rise. In the palace, a lamp burns in the window of a room where a scribe is making a final copy of a dispatch that will go out with the morning post to a provincial governor 300 miles away. This is Babylon, not the myth of it, but the thing itself. The city that was, once, the most alive place on the surface of the earth, with 200,000 people doing the things that people do in cities, working and sleeping, and arguing and loving and trading, and praying, and watching the stars and making bread, and teaching children and writing letters to people they cannot see. It is the most obvious thing in the world, and it is the easiest thing to forget, that the ruins were once alive. That the walls that dissolved in the rain were once climbed by soldiers and stood on by sentries, who could see for miles in every direction and felt, standing there above the city, something like what Nebuchadnezzar felt on his roof. Something like the enormity of being part of something this large, this consequential, this brilliantly, impossibly human. The women of Babylon. History has often told us about kings. It has less often told us about everyone else, and even less about women, whose lives in the ancient world were shaped by structures and expectations that frequently made them invisible to the record-keeping systems that kings controlled. But the women of Babylon were there, and some of them left traces. There was Kubatum, a woman from the old Babylonian period, whose name appears in a collection of love songs that are among the most beautiful texts surviving from ancient Mesopotamia. These are erotic songs, celebrations of physical love and desire that are frank and specific and tender in ways that feel remarkably modern, and they are sometimes attributed to a woman's voice speaking to her lover, sometimes to a man's voice, and sometimes to the goddess Inanna herself. Whether Kubatum was a singer, a priestess, a person of high status or low, we do not know with certainty. But her name in the text gives her a kind of individuality, a particularity that lifts her out of the anonymous mass of the unrecorded past. There was Iltani, a high-ranking woman from the city of Mari whose letters, preserved in the great archive found at that site, give us a window into the political and social world of elite Babylonian women in the early 2nd millennium BCE. She wrote to her husband about political affairs, about the management of their household, about the children, about the movements of armies in the region. She had opinions, and she expressed them. She had concerns, and she communicated them. She was a person navigating a complex world with intelligence and agency. There were the Naditu, women of high status, who were dedicated to the service of the god Shamash at the city of Sifar, not far from Babylon, and who lived in a kind of cloister, but who were also active in commerce, lending money and managing property with sophistication equal to that of any male merchant. The Naditu archives give us detailed records of women operating as economic agents in the world of old Babylonian commerce. Women who knew the law, who drafted contracts, who managed their estates over long careers. There were the thousands of unnamed women who ground the grain and cooked the bread and raised the children and carried the water and did the work that kept the city alive. We know them only through the faint traces they left in the archaeological record, through the tools found in domestic contexts, through the loom weights that tell us someone was weaving, through the cooking installations that tell us someone was feeding people. Their names are gone, their stories are gone, but their labor built Babylon as surely as the labor of the brickmakers and the masons. To tell the history of Babylon without them is to tell half a story, and half a story is always, in some sense, false. The fire that did not go out. Every civilization has a myth of its own origins. The Babylonians had several, but the most elaborate and most important was the Enuma Elish, the creation epic, whose name comes from its opening words, which mean, when on high, in the ancient Babylonian language. The Enuma Elish is not just a creation myth in the sense of explaining how the world was made. It is a theological and political document, a story about the establishment of order in the universe and the role of Babylon and its god, Marduk, in maintaining that order. It was recited in full during the New Year festival, the Akitu, the most important religious ceremony of the Babylonian calendar, a multi-day ritual that included the humiliation of the king, the great procession, and the ritual confirmation of Marduk's kingship over the gods. The story it tells is this. In the beginning, before anything else existed, there were two primordial beings, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. These two mingled together, and from their mingling, the first gods were born. The younger gods were loud and disruptive, disturbing the rest of Apsu and Tiamat, and Apsu decided to destroy them. But the clever god Ea learned of the plan and killed Apsu before he could act. From Apsu's body, Ea made his home, and it was there that his son Marduk was born. Marduk was extraordinary from his birth. He was born with 4 eyes and 4 ears, so that he could see and hear everything. He was radiant luminous, overwhelming. He was, from the beginning, more than ordinary. But Tiamat, furious at the death of Apsu and stirred up by conspirators among the gods, assembled an army of monsters and prepared for war. The other gods were afraid. They tried various champions against her and failed. Finally, they turned to Marduk, the young and powerful, and offered him supreme kingship over all the gods if he would fight Tiamat. He accepted. The battle between Marduk and Tiamat is one of the most vivid passages in ancient literature. He drove the winds into her open mouth, inflating her like a great balloon, and then struck her with his spear, splitting her in two. From her upper body he made the sky. From her lower body he made the earth. From her eyes he caused the Tigris and Euphrates to flow. He organized the heavens. He assigned the gods their duties. He established the calendar. And then he made human beings. From the blood of Kingu, the leader of Tiamat's army, Marduk fashioned humanity to be the servants of the gods, to do the work of maintaining the temples and performing the rituals and offering the sacrifices so that the gods would not have to labor. And in return for this, in gratitude for Marduk's victory and for the establishment of order, the gods built Babylon. They built it with their own hands, these divine beings, and the city they built was Esagila, the temple of Marduk, which would be the earthly home of the god who had made the world. This is what Babylonians believed about their city. Not that it was the largest or the most powerful or the most beautiful, though it was all of those things, but that it was the place where the god who had created the world had his home, that the great temple at the center of the city was the earthly reflection of the divine order that Marduk had established in the heavens, that to maintain the temple and its rituals was to participate in the ongoing project of maintaining the cosmos itself, that without Babylon and without Marduk, the primordial chaos that Tiamat represented would return. This is an enormous burden for a city to carry: the preservation of cosmic order, the prevention of chaos, the maintenance of the relationship between the human world and the divine one. And yet, it is also, in its way, a gift. Because if your city is the center of the world, if your God is the God who made the sky and the earth and the rivers, if the rituals you perform every year in your great temple are the rituals that hold the cosmos together, then you are not just a city. You are something closer to the universe itself, made concrete, made walkable, made habitable by human hands. That is what Babylon claimed to be, and for the people who lived there, for the hundreds of thousands who were born and lived and died within its walls, that claim was not abstract. It was the air they breathed, and the ground they walked on, and the water in the fountain at the end of their street, and the sound of the priests singing in the temple at the center of the world. Babylon was the center of the world, and when the center of the world fell, it left a hole in the shape of a city that has never entirely been filled. End of script. Echo. Second expansion added. WC, C, Home, Claude, Babylon, Script, TXT. The Gate and the Star. There is one last thing I want to tell you about Babylon, and it is about a particular moment, a particular object, and what it means to encounter it. In Berlin, in the Pergamon Museum, there is a room. You walk into it and you stop. Not because anyone tells you to stop. Not because there is a sign or a barrier or a guide who explains that you should stop. You stop because you cannot do anything else. Because what is in front of you is so completely outside the ordinary scale of human things that your body's first response is simply to become still. The Ishtar Gate stands there. Or rather, a reconstruction of it stands there, built from the original glazed bricks that Robert Calderwood excavated from the mud of Babylon between 1899 and 1917. Bricks that were carefully shipped to Berlin, catalogued, and assembled over decades of scholarly and curatorial work into something as close to the original gate as the evidence allows. It is not perfect. There are portions that are reconstructed from analysis rather than from actual surviving material. It does not stand to its original height. It is inside a building rather than under the open sky of Mesopotamia. And still, when you walk into that room, you stop, because the blue is so blue. It is a blue that you do not expect, a deep saturated lapis blue that belongs to the sky on a clear winter day, and it covers every surface, and the dragons and the bulls move across that blue background in a rhythm of procession that feels almost alive. That suggests the presence of something enormous and old, and not entirely of this world. The rock crystal eyes are gone now, but the animals move. They have been moving for 2,500 years, caught in the moment of their procession, marching in perfect order through whatever eternity a glazed brick is capable of containing. To stand in front of the Ishtar Gate is to understand something that no description can fully convey, which is the sheer physical ambition of what Babylon did. This was not a wealthy society making the most of scarce resources. This was a wealthy society at its peak, throwing everything it had at the creation of beauty, at the production of something overwhelming, at the statement that here, in this city, on this gate, is what human civilization looks like when it is operating without constraint. The people who made these bricks knew what they were doing. They had been making glazed bricks for generations. They understood the chemistry of the glaze, the temperature of the kiln, the shrinkage rates of the clay. They had mastered a craft of enormous difficulty and produced results of extraordinary precision. The alignment of the animals across the gate's surface, the regularity of the procession, the consistency of the colors, these are the products of skill accumulated over lifetimes and transmitted across generations. This is not spontaneous. This is practice. This is a tradition. And when you stand in front of it, in that room in Berlin, you are standing in front of the culmination of a tradition. You are standing in front of what generations of Babylonian craftspeople had been working toward, the fullest expression of their mastery, the monument that all of their smaller works had been building up to. Babylon built this gate because it could, because it had the wealth and the skill and the ambition and the faith. Because a city that believed itself to be the center of the world felt it appropriate to mark its entrance in a manner commensurate with that belief, and the gate survived. Not intact, not standing, not in its original place, but survived in the sense that enough of it was recoverable that we can still see it, that the blue is still blue, that the dragons still march, that the statement the gate was designed to make is still legible across 25 centuries and half a world. Babylon is gone. But this gate, in this room, in this city far from the Euphrates, is still saying what it was always saying, that the world was made here, that the God who made the world lived here, that the people who built this gate stood in the presence of that God every day, and they knew it, and they made their gate as worthy of that presence as human hands could make it. Rest now. You have been in Babylon. You have heard its story from the beginning, from the river and the silt and the first settlement, through the laws of Hammurabi and the walls of Nebuchadnezzar and the blue gate and the white ziggurat and the exile and the liberation and the long, slow ending. You have been in the greatest city of the ancient world, and the city, in its way, has been in you. Sleep. There is a particular kind of silence that belongs to very old places. Not the silence of emptiness, not the silence of nothing, but the silence of everything that was. A fullness that sounds like quiet. The mounds of Babylon have this silence. The museum room with the Ishtar Gate has something close to it. The tablets in their drawers, in the storerooms of the great museums have it. It is the silence of all the voices that once filled a place, compressed over centuries into something that is not quite sound and not quite absence, but something in between. Something that you can hear. If you are very still, if the noise of your own life quiets for a moment, if the night is deep enough and the dark is complete enough, and you are finally, fully, wholly here, Babylon is speaking in that silence. It has always been speaking. We have not always known how to listen. Tonight, perhaps, you heard something. Good night. And if you wake in the middle of the night, and the dark is still around you, and you feel the strange half-memory of where you have been, that flat plain between two rivers, those walls rising from the earth, those lions watching from the glazed blue walls, do not be startled. That is only Babylon, settling back into the dark where it lives now, drawing the night around itself, keeping its secrets and its silences, patient as mud brick and as old as the river. It will be there tomorrow. It has always been there, even when no one was looking, even when no one knew, In the beginning and at the end, there was only the river. There has only ever been the river.